A common assumption deserves examination before anything else. People believe their worth is decided by other people. Praise, criticism, approval, rejection, these appear to function like verdicts. When approval arrives, the mind expands. When criticism appears, the mind contracts. From this pattern, many quietly conclude that their value is determined externally. But this conclusion is not a fact. It is a judgment. Events themselves do not assign worth. A compliment is a sound. A criticism is a statement. A reputation is a collection of opinions. None of these contain authority over your value unless the mind grants that authority. This is the first Stoic correction. According to, disturbance does not arise from events themselves, but from the judgments we attach to them. If another person praises you, an event has occurred. If another person dismisses you, an event has occurred. In both cases, the event exists outside your control. What remains yours is the judgment you form about it. Your worth cannot be decided by voices outside your mind. It is decided only by the faculty that evaluates those voices. That faculty is your judgment. Notice this carefully. Authority does not transfer. A mistake appears repeatedly in human judgment. Influence is treated as ownership. Another person speaks about you. They approve or disapprove. They offer praise or criticism. Because their words affect how you feel, the mind quietly concludes that they must also possess authority over your value. But affect does not equal ownership. Someone can influence your mood without possessing authority over your character. Influence travels outward from many sources: family, colleagues, strangers, public opinion. Ownership remains elsewhere. Ownership remains with judgment. Your worth, in Stoic terms, is not a public measurement. It is a function of how you use reason, choice, and intention. These belong entirely to you. No observer can take possession of them. This is the boundary many people fail to recognize. A supervisor may evaluate your performance at work. Their judgment determines salary, promotion, or responsibility. These are external outcomes. They belong to the domain of circumstance. They are real, but they do not determine what kind of person you are. The confusion begins when outcome is mistaken for identity. Consider a simple situation. A presentation goes poorly. The audience appears unimpressed. Afterwards, someone comments that the work lacked clarity. The event is external. The comment is external. Yet the mind often converts this into a deeper conclusion: I am inadequate. Notice what has happened. An external observation has been transformed into a verdict about personal worth. The mind performs this conversion automatically unless it is examined. But the conversion itself is optional. The observation concerned a presentation. The judgment concerned the self. These are not the same domain. Another example appears in praise. Someone compliments your work. Recognition arrives. Perhaps others repeat the praise. The mind expands and concludes, I am valuable because they approve. But this conclusion contains the same error as the earlier example. Praise is an opinion. Opinion does not transfer authority. The Stoics insist on a strict boundary here. Events, outcomes, and opinions exist outside your control. Judgment, intention, and the use of reason remain yours. When these domains are mixed together, instability follows. If approval defines worth, then criticism will destroy it. If reputation determines value, then public opinion becomes a master. A person living under this rule becomes dependent on forces they cannot control. This is why Epictetus emphasized the distinction between what belongs to you and what does not. The boundary is not philosophical decoration. It is operational clarity. Your judgments are yours. Your choices are yours. Your response to events is yours. Another person's evaluation is not. That is not yours. Yet people repeatedly attempt to manage the opinions of others as if those opinions contained their identity. They adjust behavior to maintain approval. They avoid action to prevent criticism. They pursue praise as if it confirms existence. But praise cannot create worth, and criticism cannot remove it. Worth, in the Stoic sense, comes from the consistent use of reason and disciplined judgment. It is expressed through action, not granted through approval. This explains why a person can be widely admired yet internally unstable. Admiration is external. Judgment remains internal. It also explains how a person can face criticism without losing stability. Criticism is external. Judgment remains internal. The external world produces commentary. The internal faculty decides what that commentary means. When this boundary becomes clear, a significant shift occurs. Energy stops flowing toward the impossible task of controlling reputation. It returns instead to the only domain where authority actually exists: judgment. This explains where worth truly resides, but it does not yet explain how disturbance begins. The decisive moment rarely appears dramatic. It is usually quiet and almost unnoticed. Someone makes a comment about you. Perhaps it is critical, perhaps dismissive, perhaps simply careless. The words arrive as sound. They form an impression in the mind. At this stage, nothing has yet been decided. The impression has appeared. That is all. This is the first step in the Stoic mechanism described in Impression Judgment Assent Reaction. The impression is automatic. The mind receives information whether it wishes to or not. You cannot prevent impressions from appearing. What you can prevent is agreement. Between the arrival of an impression and the formation of a reaction, there is a small but decisive interval. In this interval, the mind either examines the impression or accepts it without inspection. Most disturbance begins at this point. A person hears criticism and immediately concludes that the criticism must be true. Or they assume that the critic has the authority to define their worth. These assumptions occur quickly, but they are still judgments. The Stoics call this act assent. Assent means that the mind agrees with the interpretation it has formed. The interpretation becomes a verdict. Once the verdict is accepted, the emotional reaction follows automatically. But the key point remains: impressions are involuntary, assent is not. Consider a situation at work. A colleague says your proposal lacks originality. The statement arrives. The mind registers it instantly. If the mind immediately assents to the idea that this comment defines your value, the reaction follows: irritation, insecurity, perhaps resentment. Yet the reaction did not come from the words alone. The reaction came from the judgment attached to the words. A different judgment produces a different result. The same comment could be examined instead of accepted. The mind could ask, is the criticism accurate? Does it concern a specific piece of work? Does it describe the entire person? When the judgment is examined, the authority of the statement becomes limited. It becomes information rather than verdict. The same mechanism appears in situations of praise. Someone says your work is excellent. The impression arrives. If the mind immediately assents to the idea that this praise confirms your worth, the reaction appears: pride, expansion, dependence on approval. Again, the reaction does not come from the praise itself. It comes from the judgment that praise determines value. Both cases reveal the same structure. The external event is neutral. The mind attaches meaning. The meaning becomes agreement. The agreement produces disturbance or elevation. This is why Epictetus insisted that freedom lies precisely at the point of assent. You cannot control what others say. You cannot control what impressions appear in your mind. But you can examine whether the impression deserves agreement. That examination is the pause. The pause interrupts the automatic conversion of impression into judgment. Without the pause, the mind moves quickly from observation to conclusion. With the pause, interpretation becomes deliberate. Most people never notice this moment. The mind moves so quickly that reaction appears inevitable. Yet inevitability is an illusion created by speed. When examined carefully, the sequence becomes visible. Event, impression, judgment, assent, reaction. Only one of these steps belongs entirely to you, assent. If you grant authority to another person's opinion, their words will define your worth. If you refuse that authority, their words remain external commentary. The event does not change. The mind's agreement changes. This is the point where freedom exists, but recognizing the mechanism does not yet create discipline. Many people misunderstand discipline because they associate it with pressure. They imagine discipline as force applied to the mind, resisting emotion, suppressing reaction, or enduring discomfort through willpower. Under this interpretation, discipline becomes a form of internal conflict. The mind struggles against itself, attempting to overpower impressions through effort. This is not how Stoic discipline functions. Discipline, in the Stoic sense, is training. The Greek term ascesis refers to repeated practice that develops a stable capacity. Just as physical skill improves through repetition, judgment becomes reliable through consistent examination of impressions. The goal is not to eliminate impressions. Impressions will always appear. Criticism will still be heard. Praise will still arrive. Unexpected events will still produce immediate reactions in the mind. Training changes what happens next. Without training, impressions move rapidly toward assent. The mind accepts the first interpretation that appears. A comment becomes an insult. A delay becomes disrespect. A mistake becomes evidence of personal failure. With training, the mind learns to interrupt this sequence. The interruption does not require force. It requires attention. When an impression appears, the trained mind asks a simple question: does this impression deserve agreement? That question slows the mechanism. It separates observation from judgment. The event remains visible, but the conclusion is postponed until examination occurs. This shift cannot be achieved through occasional effort. It requires repetition in ordinary situations long before pressure appears. Consider how people attempt to apply discipline during intense moments. Someone receives harsh criticism in a meeting and attempts to remain calm. Another person faces public disagreement and tries to control their reaction. In these situations, the mind is already under pressure, and training has not yet been established. The Stoic approach reverses the order. Training begins when the stakes are small. A delayed response to an email appears. The mind forms an impression: they are ignoring me. Instead of accepting this interpretation immediately, the trained mind pauses. The impression is acknowledged but not endorsed. Alternative explanations remain possible. Another situation occurs in daily inconvenience. A plan changes unexpectedly. The mind produces the judgment: this should not be happening. Again, the trained mind examines the assumption. Events occur without consulting preference. Expectation does not create authority over reality. These moments may appear insignificant, yet they are the exact locations where discipline develops. Each time the mind pauses before assent, the faculty of judgment strengthens. The pause becomes more natural. Reaction slow. Interpretation becomes deliberate rather than automatic. Importantly, Stoic discipline does not attempt to remove emotion entirely. Emotions are natural consequences of judgment. When judgment changes, emotional intensity often changes as well. But the objective is not numbness. The objective is accuracy. A trained mind experiences impressions without surrendering authority over interpretation. This is why discipline is better understood as preparation rather than resistance. When training occurs regularly in ordinary circumstances, the mind becomes capable of maintaining clarity during more difficult situations. Without preparation, reaction dominates. With preparation, examination appears before reaction. The difference between these two states is not talent or personality. It is practice. Practice establishes the pause. The pause protects judgment. And judgment determines whether the opinions of others will be treated as information or as verdict. Training makes that distinction operational. Practice, however, remains theoretical unless it appears in daily action. Philosophy becomes visible only when it appears in ordinary decisions. Grand declarations about discipline mean little if the faculty of judgment remains untrained during daily events. Stoic practice therefore focuses on small, repeatable actions that keep the mind aligned with what belongs to it. The first practice begins before events occur. The mind learns to anticipate impressions without anxiety. This does not mean expecting disaster or rehearsing fear. It means acknowledging that inconvenience, disagreement, and criticism are normal features of life. When the mind accepts this in advance, impressions lose their power to surprise. A meeting may contain disagreement. A plan may change unexpectedly. A person may misunderstand your intention. None of these events violate the structure of reality. They are ordinary occurrences. When the mind has already considered this possibility, the impression appears with less force. Instead of reacting with shock, the mind recognizes the event as expected variation. The second practice concerns the moment of assent. When an impression appears, the trained response is not immediate agreement but a brief pause. The pause does not require extended analysis. Often a single breath is sufficient. That small interruption separates the arrival of the impression from the decision to accept it. During this pause, the mind asks a simple question: is this judgment necessary? For example, someone may speak abruptly. The impression forms that the person is being disrespectful. Without the pause, the mind accepts this interpretation instantly and irritation follows. With the pause, the interpretation remains unconfirmed. The tone of voice becomes an observation rather than a verdict. The same method applies to praise. If approval appears, the mind can acknowledge it without granting it authority over self-worth. The statement remains an opinion expressed by another person. The pause preserves the boundary between external commentary and internal judgment. The third practice occurs at the end of the day. Stoic discipline includes a brief review of how the mind responded to impressions. This review is not a trial. It is an inspection. The purpose is to observe where judgment remained stable and where it moved too quickly toward assent. A person might notice that criticism earlier in the day produced irritation. Instead of condemning themselves, they examine the sequence. What impression appeared? What judgment followed? At what moment did assent occur? This analysis strengthens future awareness. The next time a similar impression appears, recognition arrives sooner. Equally important is the refusal to convert this review into guilt. Guilt is often another unexamined judgment. The mind concludes that past mistakes define the present self. Yet Stoic practice treats errors as information about how judgment operates under pressure. The purpose is correction, not condemnation. When the day is examined calmly, each mistake becomes material for training. Through these repeated practices, anticipation, pause, and review, the faculty of judgment gradually stabilizes. External events continue to occur, and opinions continue to circulate. What changes is the mind's willingness to treat those opinions as final authority. Authority remains where it has always been, in the use of reason. When this practice becomes consistent, the relationship between external opinion and internal worth changes fundamentally. Freedom is often imagined as independence from other people's opinions. Many assume that freedom appears when criticism disappears and approval becomes constant. Under this definition, a person remains dependent on conditions they cannot control. This is not the freedom the Stoics describe. External circumstances do not become stable. Praise still appears. Criticism still appears. Reputation still changes depending on who is speaking and what situation is unfolding. None of these conditions become reliable sources of identity. The change occurs elsewhere. Freedom appears when the mind no longer treats external opinion as authority over worth. This does not mean ignoring what others say. Opinions may contain useful information. Criticism may reveal an error in action. Praise may acknowledge work that was done well. The Stoic does not reject information. The Stoic refuses to confuse information with identity. A person may receive criticism about a decision. The decision may indeed contain flaws. The correction can be accepted. The action can improve. Yet the criticism still concerns the action, not the worth of the person making it. This distinction preserves stability. Without it, every external evaluation becomes a verdict about the self. Approval produces inflation. Disapproval produces collapse. The mind oscillates according to the opinions of others. When judgment becomes disciplined, this oscillation ends. Another person's approval remains their judgment. Another person's disapproval remains their judgment. These statements exist in the external world. They may influence circumstances, but they do not determine character. Character is revealed through the consistent use of reason and choice. These remain internal faculties. Consider a public situation. A person receives recognition for successful work. Applause appears. Others express admiration. The external event may be pleasant, but the Stoic mind treats it as circumstance rather than proof of worth. The applause is not yours. Equally, imagine the opposite situation. A mistake becomes visible. Others criticize the decision. Reputation temporarily declines. The Stoic mind observes the criticism and examines whether correction is necessary. The criticism is not yours. In both cases, the external reaction belongs to others. The internal response belongs to you. This is the structure of inner freedom. Freedom does not mean that life becomes comfortable. Events continue to unfold without consulting preference. Praise and blame continue to circulate. Outcomes continue to shift according to factors outside personal control. What changes is the location of authority. Authority returns to judgment. When judgment remains stable, the opinions of others lose their power to define identity. They become external observations rather than internal verdicts. The mind listens when useful, ignores when necessary, and maintains responsibility for its own interpretation. This state does not appear suddenly as an achievement. It requires maintenance through continued examination of impressions and careful use of assent. Freedom therefore remains an ongoing discipline, not a permanent possession. Nothing outside the mind needs to change for this discipline to begin. The principle is complete. Quietly consider the conclusion that has emerged. Your worth has never been decided by other people. What others say about you belongs to them. Praise is their opinion. Criticism is their opinion. Reputation is a shifting collection of judgments that circulate in the external world. None of these possess authority over your character unless you grant that authority through your own judgment. This is the point Epictetus insisted on repeatedly. Responsibility cannot be transferred. The faculty that evaluates impressions remains yours, and no external voice can remove it. According to the Stoic discipline outlined in Freedom appears precisely at the moment of assent, when the mind decides whether an impression deserves agreement. This does not mean you will never make mistakes. Actions may fail. Decisions may require correction. Criticism may reveal something useful. But correction concerns action, not the worth of the person acting. Responsibility therefore remains simple, though not easy. Examine impressions. Pause before assent. Maintain the boundary between external opinion and internal judgment. When this boundary holds, the question who decides your worth loses its confusion. The answer has always been the same. The authority that decides your worth is the way you use your reason, your judgment, and your choices. No one else possesses that faculty. Practice this today in something small.